Well, hello there. I didn't see you come in. Make yourself at home. Have a drink. While I give some attention to some underappreciated characters and storylines that I personally love. And I hope you grow to love as well. Hey there, everybody. Welcome back. Today we are reading Swamp Thing number 105. And just a quick recap on what's been going on in the last couple issues. Swamp Thing and his family are in the Parliament of Green inside of the Amazon. And they came down there for two things. One of them is because they are being chased by a bad guy named Matango, who is Avatar of the Gray and all fungus life. And as part of that, the other reason why they needed to go down to the Amazon is because their daughter Tefe lost her body, and she was vulnerable, or extra vulnerable, I guess, to Matango while in that state. So after trying many times to figure out how to resurrect her body, Swamp Thing figures he could talk to the Parliament and they could help her return to human form. So that's what happens. Swamp Thing and his family go to the inner circle of the Parliament where the original 13 elders live, and they help Tefe grow her body back, so now she's human again. And then also they give a bunch of history about Matango. It turns out Matango and all fungus life are just alien species from space. A fight between the gray and the green began, and part of that fight was Matango corrupting humans in the Garden of Eden. But there has been a stalemate ever since then, and it's kind of like a Cold War where both sides really don't like each other, but they also don't want to fight a war with each other. And that all changed when Swamp Thing came back from his time travel journey that we covered in the Rick Veitch run, and also his daughter Tefe was born. So those two things woke up Matango from his sleep that he'd been in for, thousands or hundreds of thousands of years. And now he does want a war with the Green. Specifically, he wants to corrupt Swamp Thing and Tefe. So Swamp Thing, knowing this, wants to fight Matango directly, but the inner parliament takes a vote and there's kind of a stalemate on what they should do about this. And in order to break the stalemate, Swamp Thing is going to find all the other parliament members that have been taken by Matango as prisoners, and he's going to free them one by one and then talk to them and try to convince them to vote the way he wants on the war against Matango. And that is where we left off. That was a lot to recap, but that last issue had a lot of exposition in it. So first things first, with issue 105, we got the cover here. We see Swamp Thing. He's standing in the center of a room that is made of all stone, and there's carvings all over the place. And these carvings look like they're from Mesoamerican origin. And besides Swamp Thing in this room, there is a couple other entities. There is a green being behind him that looks like a seed pod that's in the shape of a heart, I guess. It's a little weird looking. It's got some branches coming off of it, but it's definitely part of the green. And Swamp Thing looks like he's protecting it from the other beings, which look like spinal cords and brain stems and heads that are growing out of the ground, and they're made of fungus, and the heads kind of look like chickens, but they got red eyes, and they definitely look like they're about to attack. And we see on the cover that this is the second part of the storyline called The Quest for the Elementals, and that is written by Doug Wheeler with art by Mike Hoffman. So we start off on page 1. Swamp Thing has left Tefe and Abby with the Parliament of Trees, and he has gone on the search for the elementals, specifically one named Canon Cax. They don't really say if this is a special elemental or something, or why Swamp Thing's starting with him. It just seemed like Swamp Thing saw his husk in the Parliament of Trees and was like, oh, I'll start with that one. So he's gone to look for Canon. And Swamp Thing's narration says, I've been scanning the green nearly a day, searching the Yucatan forests for an ancient forebearer lost, his ghost long trapped, his freedom stolen, concealed among the silenced multitudes of a revenant nation. So Swamp Thing's looking, and he's being pulled towards the Mayan pyramids in the Yucatan Peninsula. And he's being pulled towards one specific pyramid. So he does this cool thing where he turns his body into a bunch of vines and then kind of snake through all the cracks and crevices of this pyramid until they can get to the interior part of it. And when he gets to the center, he finds a big room, kind of like the one that was on the cover, where there's it's all stone and there's carvings everywhere. And also in the room, Swamp Thing does find what he's looking for. He finds Canon Cax, and Canon's body is encased in a bunch of sap that is formed into a crystal that's surrounding him. Then we cut to Abbe and Tefe, who are in the grove of the Parliament of Trees, And Abby is playing with Tefe, enjoying the fact that Tefe now has a new body, when all of a sudden they hear gunshots that are coming from outside the grove of the Parliament. And I'm not totally sure why, but Abby decides it would be a good idea to go check out what's going on with her baby. So she walks out to the entrance of the grove while still holding Tefe. Her leg is still hurt and she does have crutches, so it's kind of a weird, awkward walk. But when she gets to the entrance of the grove, she finds all of the indigenous protectors of the grove dead, except one. It was the one that had the camera from before. I don't know if I mentioned that in the last issue, but these indigenous people have been getting harassed by people who are cutting down the forest. So one of them had a camera and was trying to film all of these things happening to the forest and to their people so that they could get like news coverage, I guess, or have proof that all this stuff's going on illegally. So that guy, I guess because he wasn't out in the open and he had his camera out, he wasn't shot, but all the other people in his tribe were. So when Abby walks out into the area where all these dead men are, he comes out of nowhere and kind of surprises Abby and says, "Are you here for their souls to take them into the sacred grove?" And Abby's just looking at him kind of startled and says, what happened? And he says, "The ranchers hired men to kill us. They want to burn the land for their cattle to graze. We were in their way. The earth spirits did nothing. We couldn't retreat through the grove. It's sacred. We were trapped. The forest abandoned us." And then they hear a twig snap and they turn around, and the men who killed the other indigenous people are behind them with guns. And when they see Abby, they decide to take her, Tefe, and the indigenous man that was left alive back to their camp. Then we go back to Swamp Thing, who is still looking at the crystal around Kanan Cax, and he's trying to figure out what to do, and the narration says, "The Parliament opposed my journey here, afraid my actions might renew the war between the green and the gray. But Matango has already taken hundreds of Parliament members captive, as slaves for the gray, or as immobilized prisoners. He wishes to add Tefe to his shadow realm as well." And as he's looking into the crystal, we do see that there's some kind of weird shapes that are floating around the body of Kanan Cax that are also enclosed inside the crystal. So Swamp Thing looks at them and he says, "This prison is laced with fungi guards to stop any escape. But the fungi's sustenance comes from the gray's energy fields, overlapping the green's on a separate frequency. But there are many such frequencies, multiple energy fields, which amplified might jam out the gray, cutting the guards from their life source." So Swamp Thing begins to concentrate, and I guess he singles out the frequency that the gray is on, because we don't see any of the like frequency lines or anything, but he's just staring at the crystal. So I'm assuming that that's what's going on. So as he's focusing on the crystal, all of a sudden it explodes and the crystal shatters, and Kanan Cax is now freed. I will say Kanan looks a bit different than on the cover. On the cover, he's nice and green, but on these interior pages, he's like super just dark brown. So once Kanan is fully out of the crystal shards, he looks at Swamp Thing and says, "Hello, Holland creator. Thank you at last for rescuing ourself." And Swamp Thing's confused by the use of the word ourself, but Kanan explains, "Forgive me, I have always found difficult keeping separate my memories from those of the founders before me, including yours." So because of the whole Swamp Thing is his own grandpa kind of thing when he went back in time, Kanan knows everything about Swamp Thing, just like all the other Parliament of Trees elders did. And he even asked Swamp Thing if the baby was born, and Swamp Thing tells him yes, Tefe was born. And while they're talking, we get a panel that shows a pulled out view from where they're at in the room, and we see on the wall that there is some fuzzy, I'm assuming it's fungus, growing and moving. But Swamp Thing and Kanan don't notice because they're talking still. And Kanan is still getting his words confused. He's still confusing his memories with everybody else's memories in the green, including Swamp Thing's. And it gets to the point where he can't keep his own memories straight. So Swamp Thing looks at him and says, "Kanan Cax, you must be certain of your identity before we enter the green. Perhaps recalling how you became trapped here might help." And I'm not sure if Swamp Thing's doing this to be nice, or if it's like a combination of that, and he just wants to know the full story of why Kanan Cax got here. So Kanan replies, "Back during the Great Migration after the loss of Eden, I came to this forest with several others, scouting for a site where we could root the Parliament once more. We were surrounded by those whom the Grey had absorbed. I decided to burrow within my sap, using the Earth's heat to harden my shield. Unable to move, I watched seasons pass. So in these panels, we're seeing that Kanan is being surrounded by the parliament members who have been corrupted by Matango. And then as he's building this sap shield that's turning into crystal around him, some of the corrupted are able to kind of put these little seeds of fungus inside of that sap, which is possibly what is growing on the wall behind Swamp Thing, but they don't know that yet. And then we see once Kanan is fully encapsulated and he's been there for a long time, mushrooms are growing at the base of his crystal, and there are humans that look like indigenous people going up to the mushrooms and picking them. And Kanan continues, I saw great empires fall and rise. And Swamp Thing says, what happened here to the Maya? Referencing the Mayan people that lived here at one time. And Kanan answers, man's inherent tendency for self-destruction, encouraged by Matango, the Mayan priests ate from the gray's fruit, hallucinogenic mushrooms, for divination and communion with their gods. But the visions and instructions they received all came from Matango, from his dreams to destroy and remake the worlds in his image. He encouraged the Mayans to set torch to their forests, to make room for their cities and clear land for their crops. But most of their sustenance still came from the forests, which soon took several days' journey to reach. Their civilization collapsed with the land that they burned. And in these panels, we're seeing, a medicine man take the mushrooms, and then we're seeing the indigenous people cutting down and burning the forest. We're also seeing the human sacrifices take place. So they're insinuating that Matango was the one who was making them do that. And telling this story does seem to center Kanan on himself and his own identity. So now that he's pulled himself together, he asks Swamp Thing, Holland, creator, does my freedom mean the war between us and the Grey is over? And Swamp Thing looks at him and says, no, it is beginning again. And then Kanan asks, then what of the fates of all the others also made prisoner by Matango? And then we cut back to Tefe and Abby and the indigenous men who are now being held prisoner by these mercenaries who are working for the cattle companies that are tearing out the forests. So as they're walking farther away from the grove, all of a sudden Abby remembers the reason why Swamp Thing left her and Tefe in the grove, and that is to protect Tefe from Matango. So as she remembers this, she yells out, Matango! Oh no, I forgot about him. We have to take my baby back. Something evil is after her. It'll destroy us all. But the men that have her at gunpoint just look at her and say, your Indians already tried that, saying monsters would come. Shut up. And then another man looks at him and says, let her rave. It won't matter soon anyway. She'll just be joining the rest of the village. And as this guy says this, they walk out of the forest and into a clearing where there's bulldozers and a bunch of machinery, and they're tearing down the forest. But one of those bulldozers is actually covering up a mass grave of a bunch of indigenous people. And if Abby wasn't taking them serious before, she's definitely taking them serious now. And as the bulldozer is covering up these people, they're still yelling. So they're still alive, or at least some of them are, and they're just being covered by dirt and murdered. So the mercenaries walk Abby, Tefe, and the indigenous man over to the pit of bodies. And the indigenous man was holding Tefe, of course, because Abby has to use crutches. So one of the mercenaries says, give me that baby, you Indian pig shit. And then they proceed to push the indigenous man into the pits, and they open fire with a machine gun, which kills him and a couple of the other people that were still alive in the pit. And Abby's freaking out because these men now have Tefe, and she's yelling, leave her alone, no! And as she's fighting, the head guy in charge walks over to Abby and puts a gun to her head and says, now, little mother, what should we do with you? And Abby says, please don't hurt my baby. And the man says back, a healthy white baby like this? She's worth too much to kill. But you? And then the guy turns to all the other men and says, men, what do you think we should do with this one? And one of them responds, she's too pretty to kill right away. And then the guy holding Tefe says, you think you have the stamina after all those Indian girls? So these mercenaries banter back and forth a little bit more, and they get to the point where they've decided that they want to rape Abby. And right before they do that, the man in charge says, wait, no, I've changed my mind. Just kill her. And she's on her hands and knees on the ground, and we get a zoomed up panel where we do see all of them standing there from far away, and we hear and see 2 gunshots. So Abby has just been murdered in front of Tefe. And I should say that Tefe's been here the whole time. She's kind of been crying and saying mama, but she can't really say more than that. And if I'm remembering correctly, in the last issue, they were talking in full sentences, but I think that's because they were in the green or at least in the grove. And being there made it so Tefe could speak full sentences to her parents. So I think now that they're out of the grove, she kind of just sounds like a baby again, maybe knows a couple words. And then, of course, they leave us with that hanging, and they cut back to Swamp Thing, who is now explaining to Kanan why he woke him up and why he needs him and his vote for the parliament in order to confront Matango. And when he's talking about confrontation, Swamp Thing doesn't necessarily want the war. It seems like he has a plan to maybe talk to Matango, see if he can reason with him, because he says, Matango must agree to release those of us he has taken and leave Tefe and her future descendants unmolested. There can be no peace otherwise. And then out of nowhere, they hear a voice behind them. And what's talking is all the fungus that was crawling on the walls from earlier. They had worked their way down the walls to some weapons that were leaning against the stone. And I guess they took the shape of these weapons before they started to attack. So these weapons kind of look like spears, but instead of one single pointed head of the spear, it's got like multiple blades on it. So there are 4 of these spears on the wall. So there's 4 fungus beings that now take those shapes. And as Swamp Thing is just finishing his idea about how there could be peace, one of them says, peace between us there never has been, only a prolonged calm. And Swamp Thing's like, what the heck are these? And Kanan says that these are Matango's servants or ambassadors to Mayan who oversaw the sacrifices that were made here. So even though they have Swamp Thing and Kanan Cax surrounded, they don't attack right away. They begin to talk to Swamp Thing, and they say, fooled us you tried to, with vile diversion, sending your daughter outside while you sneaked to our jails. But it worked did not, for we saw through your evil. She's but miles from the parliament and could be yanked back in a second. And upon hearing that Tefe might be in danger, Swamp Thing hesitates. And Kanan Cax, seeing this, warns Swamp Thing, their power is limited to persuasion and mind control. Don't listen to any of their tricks. And when they hear this, the attackers basically tell Kanan Cax to shut up, and they proceed to try to convince Swamp Thing to leave Kanan Cax there. They say that they'll let Swamp Thing go without trying to harm him if he does so. And the reason they want him to leave Kanan there is because they're saying that if Swamp Thing takes Kanan Cax, it will upset the balance of power between their kinds, and it will be an act of aggression that cannot be ignored. But Swamp Thing does not have any intention of leaving Kanan Cax there, so he shoots out a bunch of vines that grab onto the attackers and hold them there, and then he grabs Kanan Cax by the arm, and they both flee into the green. Then we cut back to Tefe, who's just seen Abby, her mom, murdered in front of her, and she yells out, Mama! And then the mercenary who is hanging onto her slaps her across the face and says, shut up, I hate crying babies. And then he goes to strike her again, and as he does, all of a sudden, she looks at him with a deathly stare, and the skin on his hand begins to melt away. And he drops Tefe as this is happening, of course, because he's freaked out and surprised. And then as she lands on the ground, his entire body explodes. And it looks like his skin just completely melts off of him with his muscle, and his skeleton and organs burst out of what's left of his body. And then a chain reaction starts of all the other mercenaries. Their bodies explode as well, along with all the animals in the near vicinity, and also all of the people in the village that's nearby. But I don't think Tefe realizes that she just murdered hundreds of people. I think she just thought she was trying to kill the mercenaries who were attacking her and her mother. So now that all the mercenaries are dead, Tefe crawls over to Abby's limp body and she says, Ma? And then she reaches out a hand and she says another word in baby speech, which I'm assuming is help. And then Tefe waves her hands in the air and Abby's body falls apart and becomes kind of like a clay, but it's still flesh and blood. And we see that Abby's spirit all of a sudden appears inside of this floating blob of clay flesh. And then Tefe surrounds Abby's spirit with the clay and begins to form Abby a new body. And then Abby's spirit takes consciousness inside this new body, and she begins to look around and sees all this carnage and dead people exploded. And she says, Tefe, what have you done? And then we cut back to Swamp Thing, who is now arriving with Kanan Cax back to the grove of the Parliament of Trees. And Yggdrasil tells Swamp Thing that Tefe and Abby have left the Parliament's protection and gone outside of the grove. And as he's about to leave to go help them, Yggdrasil tells Swamp Thing, when you are finished there, Tefe did something today which we will need to discuss. And then we cut back to Abby and Tefe, and they have moved, I guess, from where they were and have gone back to the outer circle of the Parliament of Trees, kind of by the entrance. And Abby is just sitting down in the fetal position as Tefe's playing with a toy plane that she found. And Swamp Thing approaches them and says, Abby, I'm back. Abby, are you all right? Your broken leg, the stitches in your head, where are they? And Abby doesn't respond immediately. She seems like she's kind of dissociated or something. But she comes to as Swamp Thing goes over and says her name again. And then she looks at Swamp Thing and says, all those people, Alec. And Swamp Thing says, what people? And Abby turns to him and responds, I died with them, Alec. I'm one of the dead. Why am I still alive? And we are left with that question hanging because this is the end of the issue. So if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains.and-comic-books, all one word, at gmail.com. And until next time, remember to stay swampy.